Welcome to Chapter 18, the impacts of government borrowing. So we'll look at how it affects investment and trade balances. Government borrowing impacts those things. The relationship between fiscal policy, investment, and economic growth, the impact of government borrowing on private savings, and the effect of government fiscal policy has on trade balances. And so we've talked about a number of these in other settings. This is a nice reintroduction to algebra, and all those letters stand for something that's explained here. For example, S is private savings. So whenever you see S, it's private savings. You'll note that our total savings and the inflow of foreign financial capital equals M minus X, or imports minus exports. So once you have imports minus exports, you have really your trade balance, your trade good balance. So that's your inflow of foreign financial capital. Then you have government budget deficit, which is the government spending minus taxes. If taxes are higher, then you actually don't have a deficit, you'd have a surplus. But in the US's case, for most years since the 70s, we spend more than we bring in taxes. So we'd have a bit of a government deficit there. And what we've done is we've moved from solving two pieces of the equation to one private investment equation, and this is done through basic algebra of subtracting things from the same side and moving things so that we end up with this equation minus this equation. And another way to do that is to reverse it, taxes minus government spending, to the other side to solve for I. The two pieces of the graph here, I want to just highlight, again, pause when there's lots of detail, but budget deficits rising, or so we're actually spending more even than we've taken in the past, or we used to have a surplus, but it's getting smaller and smaller. We're getting closer to zero or a deficit. So those are the same things. They're basically saying spending is rising faster than taxes. And what that does is it decreases domestic private investment. It can decrease private savings. I mean, it can raise private savings, or it can lead to an increased trade deficit. So it can have one or more of these three effects. If we're taking in more and more relative to what we're spending, and our deficit is getting smaller and smaller if we have one, or our surplus is getting bigger and bigger if we have one, then you would see domestic private investment rise, private saving falling, and the trade deficit falling. One or more of these three things would begin to happen. So we've run budget deficits for over 30 years, with the exception of 1999 and 2000, mainly due to military expenditures, entitlement programs, the decrease in tax revenue, with increased safety nets supporting during the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. For example, you see significant in 9, 10, 11 deficits because of responding to that recession. And if we were to update it, through at least 2018, it would look like this. 2019 and 20 have probably been even worse than predicted because the pandemic wouldn't have been seen coming. Because when governments borrow, a lot of that borrowing is bought in the form of government bonds, which is what the government debt is by you and I. we tend to see greater savings because when I buy that bond, I'm holding on to it. I've got money tied up now in savings. So generally, as private or as governments borrow, what you will see is savings increase in the private sector because we are some of the owners of that government debt in the form of government bonds, treasury bonds being one example. An increase in government borrowing can shift the demand curve for financial capital to the right. And we talked about this before, where if the government is wanting currency as well as others, it drives the demand up. So it shifts the curve to the right, which means there's likely more money available at a higher rate. We can look and see what's been happening in the relationship of spending in dollars on education. And so there's been an increase in spending on education until after the recession, and now that's come back down. There's debate about where that should go in the future as we look out past this timeline of the graph. So here's just a picture from 2016. The inflation adjusted government spending per student in higher education. And so government used to spend about $3,500 per student back around 1960, up to over $9,000 per student in 2016, and that number has steadily increased. The Ricardian equivalent says that households will think long term, that we think beyond our present circumstances and will change our savings rate in response to government borrowing. In fact, right now, there is above a 20% savings rate in the US, which is incredible. An example would be that government increases its spending in a current period to stimulate the economy, like right now. Households, though, knowing that taxes will increase in the future to pay for all that increased spending, they don't spend as much money today. They offset the effects of that increased government spending by diminishing their own current spending, holding that money, knowing that the bill is going to be paid later, if you will. Critics to this Ricardian equivalence say that households really only think of the current period. For the most part, we don't think that far out. And I just ask you which seems more likely, given the data I've seen recently. Ricardian equivalence actually fits what we see. Not every family can save more right now if you have lost a job or had the hours of work that you used to do cut. So twin deficits create economics instability, and the twin deficits are a government budget deficit where the government's spending more than it brings in tax, and a trade deficit where we buy more from other countries than we sell to them. And at first it leads to governments having to borrow and take inflow of funds from international investors. So that borrowing, some of it you and I do, but also other people and institutions around the world, international individuals and organizations are lending some of that money or buying some of that debt of the US government, and that appreciates the currency. The second wave then is that investors start to get concerned about ability to pay, and they leave the country, they pull their money out, it depreciates the currency, it causes a major financial crisis, and it leads to major increased poverty. This hasn't ever happened in the US, this second step, but it is happening in many parts of Europe, it's happened in many parts of Asia, it's happened in many parts of Latin America, where for a time investors saw lending to those governments as a good investment, and then when they decided the risk was too great, it left the country in that second depreciating currency and struggling economy. Now imagine that the US government has increased its borrowing and that the funds come, in this case, from European investors. To buy those government bonds, the investors will need to demand more US dollars out on the foreign exchange market. That's how they pay for the bonds, the debt being issued by the US government. And that will cause the demand for US dollars to shift right, to increase. And that alone, if we had done that, we would have ended up at this equilibrium point with more dollars demanded at a higher price. But European financial investors as a group are also less likely to supply US dollars to the foreign exchange market because now they're more valuable. So they want to hold on to them. So that will actually impact the supply of US dollars out in the marketplace available for others, and it decreases it, so it shifts it left. So we end up at this new equilibrium point, which they showed no change in quantity, both increased price, one increased quantity, the other decreased quantity. They happened to draw it so that they were equal and we didn't change the overall supply or equilibrium point for dollars in the world marketplace. So large deficit and debts can negatively affect economic growth. That probably doesn't surprise you. And